Finnish star AWPer allu, formerly of ENCE and NIP and Mouse Sports, has joined FaZe, the famous international team where obviously the actual org itself is from North America and hails from Call of Duty, and he will be replacing Fox there as the primary AWPer. Now, as I always do in the current format of like how I do to do additions to teams, I'd like to discuss first of all the player removed and whether that was justified. So the player removed, I mean, technically hasn't left the team yet. The actual wording in the press release said that he was replacing Fox, but then they put who in the immediate will be removed from the active roster as we discuss his future prospects. So technically, Fox could be a sub, or in theory, they could bring him back later. It seems very unlikely. It seems almost certain that Fox is on the way out, and at the very least is a sub, and if not, just to ride out his salary, get the rest of his salary, and then go elsewhere. So in terms of removing Fox, I think he's the obvious player to remove. Sure, you can actually certainly make a case for removing some of the others, in as much as a bunch of the other players have essentially had their own skill and own impact on the game nullified by playing with so many other good players, but in a setup, a composition, a constellation that doesn't really work to amplify or emphasize the skills of each player. And some players are playing each other's role, and so one person has to go to a secondary role, or they're playing roles which don't have supportive role type players around them who can help them and emphasize and facilitate their skill. And the balance of roles is quite poor in the team. So I mean, an obvious name that I think stands out actually of someone who isn't as good in FaZe as he probably would be elsewhere. And if you were going to put in a player who was an all-round player, you might pick to remove, is maybe you'd remove Jacob, because he was fantastic when he first joined the team, but he's had his issues. He seems to be one of those guys who disappeared into the background. So if you had the opportunity to bring in like an MBK type player, yeah, I'd bring him in instead of Jacob, actually. Probably could fill in different roles better, help other people be better, whereas Jacob has to try and be a star player. That's what his skill set is, and that's what he has difficulty doing. Even so, as much as you could make a case for anyone else, the obvious player and the worst player clearly is Fox. I mean, not least because he's the primary AWPer of FaZe. And so, I have said this many times before, but except in very rare exceptional cases like certain rounds or certain halves, I don't think that the AWPer in a team the primary AWPer should be a player who is one of the worst players in the team, and certainly should not be a player who was as bad or ineffective when we talk about the context of a top 10 team in the world as Fox was in FaZe. In that scenario, you only want players like that to be AWPing if it's like you pick up a secondary AWP, like you found it on the floor or something. You don't want to be buying AWPs for that player. You don't want to be putting AWPs in that guy's hand as often as you can. You never want it where in like a team like FaZe, one of the big problems I thought was if you have a superstar player and nearly all the other players except Keo for me have the skills to be a star or a superstar in the world of Counter-Strike, I don't want those guys winning a 1v1, then dropping their rifle, picking up an AWP, dropping it for Fox, and then themselves having to either go to like a Galil or something like that if the money's low. That's a scenario where logically you do it because the weapon's worth so much, but I actually think that's a minus EV expected variance play. I think it's a negative play to do because Fox isn't a good enough AWPer. If you have Kenny S or you have someone else like that, sure, that can work out for you. So if Fox was a rifler and also was a good supportive role player and he actually had that kind of aspect to his game, then I'd say, okay, it's maybe doable to keep him. Like I said, there's reasons why some of the star players aren't playing like stars in the team. But since that isn't his role, he's not a good rifler, and he's not even particularly a supportive role player either. Doesn't seem to suit his strengths either. I think he should be like a star player on a lesser team. So as a result, I think he's the obvious name to pick, and I'm glad they finally picked him and finally got to him because he's been in the team for a long time. So he's had his full try, he's had as long of a run as he could have needed, and he hasn't shown us much more than he's going to show us now. He isn't going to show us much more than he's shown us now. And we've kind of seen the full gamut of what's possible. The good tournaments, the really bad tournaments, the middling tournaments, the below average tournaments. And the overall trend is, like, yeah, not a particularly good player, especially not for a team of FaZe's caliber. Bearing in mind, as a player who's not a star, he doesn't do the things that you want from a player who isn't a star within your team. Now, in terms of adding allu, I also think this is a good move. So it's a good move to remove Fox. I think adding allu is a good move. First of all, I will say allu's time in ENCE, the Finnish team, which he's like some sort of part owner of or something and somehow involved in starting the project, I actually expected when he went to this team, he was going to go ham. I thought he was going to go like, not full Oscar mode, because he was never that sort of player, but he'd be like consistently the best player, carrying nearly all the games. He'd been so good individually that wouldn't matter how Ents did, you'd be like, wow, see, everyone's seen again what a really world-class player this guy was, because he'd been freed up from secondary roles that he was getting forced into in NIP. Because NIP, no matter what you say, at least until Threat came in, was the Get Right in Forest show. And Get Right in Forest play the roles they want to play and the spots they want to play, and you better adapt around them. That's, by the way, when they were very, very good players, that's entirely justifiable. Problem they had was in latter years, when each of them had times when they weren't as good a player, they might have needed to be more adaptive and let other people shine. So, with that said, I mean, for example, I don't think it's a coincidence that allu was at his best when he first joined NIP, when I actually think, because they were like looking for a new player now, and they were so happy to have him over Makelele because he didn't have the social different clashing dynamic with NIP that Makelele did. I think that when they got allu in initially, they did work around him more and did put him in spots he wanted to be and helped him more in the team. And that's why he was at his best. He shone. He was like arguably the best player in the team at that point in time. So, not only freeing him up from the roles from NIP, but also the pressure, the expectation, people shitting on him because he's not one of the original four, and therefore blaming him and saying, like, Fiflarum would be better than him, and ridiculous shit like that. Like, I destroyed in my Thorin vs. Reddit video that I'll link up there, which is an absolutely ridiculous opinion if you looked at the end of NIP when Fiflarum was in it. So, I actually thought, putting a line through his career with NIP, I thought in NIP over 2015, he was a top 3 player in the team. He had times when he was best or second best, obviously very good at Katowice. I think he was a top 3 player in the team. I thought he certainly fulfilled like the role of like a star, a semi-star. It was a good primary AWPer. I think through his whole career, he's been a very reliable AWPer. That's a key detail. Reliable in terms of like hit rate. He's going to hit those certain shots, so 6/7 out of 10 level shots. Especially, by the way, uniquely good actually at medium to close range. I actually think medium range is his best range with the AWP. He's not one of those AWPers who has to take the super long range shot. He's not the guy who is just going to hold the one spot and then kill like 4 people when they're on by every time. But he's going to hit those first 1 to 2 shots at any kind of medium range. So I think famously of like, if you're talking about like the Dust 2 area around the A site, this is an ideal spot for this guy to be. And he's just going to get those kills reliably time and time again. So he has a very good base for your team as an AWPer. Also reliable in as much as he doesn't seem to get rattled by pressure. He can have bad games. He can get outplayed, sure. But he doesn't seem to choke. He doesn't seem to get tilted. He doesn't seem to get rattled by pressure. He just does his job. And he doesn't seem to mind what people in the team say or what happens. He's just a soldier. He works away. So I think that's very good for a team like this, where you're going to have a lot of ups and downs in FaZe. And you're going to have star players who might be raging or upset or tilted or choking or whatever else, and you just want a reliable guy you're slotting in here to bring up the overall day-to-day level, where the others can be up and down a variable. Now you've got Rain and now you've got allu, who in theory can be more reliable parts in the team, and now the others don't have to go crazy all the time, but if you can get one of them going, now you've got a base for a team, right? So I think a very good addition there. He's an obvious upgrade over Fox. He's a much better primary AWPer, and just as a team it makes more sense. In terms of the fact in this international team, obviously they speak English, because it goes without saying Kiyashima does not speak fucking Swedish or Norwegian. Allu obviously speaks English. I mean, he's someone where if people haven't spoken to him before, they might initially have difficulty understanding him, but that's just because that's what happens whenever you talk to anyone that has a really strong accent from somewhere they come from. It used to happen to me when I first started talking to international people. They just have to tune into your ear, and from talking to them and having misunderstandings, you'll start to learn yourself which words to soften, and then suddenly you'll see it sort of lights up, the recognition, and they understand it, and naturally the two of you merge together, and you'll be able to understand the guy. So I think he's going to be very good in that sense. He certainly, I'm sure, has better English than Fox did. Now, in terms of what's next for FaZe, I think for FaZe, if you notice, they've very rarely been in my top 10 rankings. That's because, despite having good players, despite having online results every now and then, if you look offline, they weren't winning best of 3 series over anyone. It just wasn't happening. They were very rarely even getting that really big upset map. They've actually been quite an underwhelming team. They've mainly bashed the shit out of Tier 2, qualified for majors and whatnot, but then they haven't really done anything of note. So the reason why they haven't been top 10 for me is because they didn't have any of the qualities you need to be a top 10 team. Sure, they had the skill, but they didn't even apply that skill and make the most of it. They didn't have great tactics. They didn't have the sickest team play. Obviously, it's a very mixed team. They didn't ever have a good balance of roles. They didn't have the star player. They didn't have the good supportive / role players. They didn't have the good in-game leader. They're still working on it. They had all sorts of problems, almost every problem you could have, except skill. So what's funny is, I actually think with the addition of allu, FaZe already for me have been on a slight upward trajectory. They're getting a little bit better at a time. Problem is they're not ready yet to win the top 10 teams in best of 3s necessarily. Although I think they could take some of the bottom ones at this point in time if they played them at the right point in the tournament. But I think this is FaZe's chance to become a 5th to 8th type team. Allu will bring a level of consistency. He'll play that AWPing role well. Beyond that 5th, 8th role, I think the only way they get better is they've got to get a defined star. Now, personally, I think it's got to be either AZ or Jacob, because I look when these two guys play really well as star players, they really do elevate a team, and with the players they have around them now, they would be very dangerous. Like, the reason why I don't pick Rain is because I've seen Rain play really well in this team, and this team still lose. Now, that's not fair to say just in isolation, like only one of them gets to be a star. But put it this way, if you pick AZ or Jacob and one of those players like a star player, so right now, you'd say it's going to be AZ because Jacob's been off for quite a while. The good thing about Rain is he doesn't need to be our star. He's such a good all-round player. I think he can be the 3rd best player, the hybrid type player. And he's such a good all-rounder, clutch shares, holding certain spots, playing intelligently, that I think that added to the star player there. And then the level of basic consistency, I mean, you have the term the ceiling of the team. Well, if you talk about like the basement level of the team, the ground floor of the team is going to be Allu's level, bringing it up there from where Fox brought it. I think overall, that consistency they're going to have, and then having a defined star player would make FaZe a very dangerous team, where now they could be some sort of sick upset team, and we really could see a great run from them. Now, in terms of what's next for Fox, like I said, I think the reason why he hasn't just left and been kicked entirely is because you get an awesome salary if you're in FaZe. They've had one of the best salaries in a long time. That's one of the reasons why Fox fans really should not be crying. When you bear in mind, for the last sort of 6 to 8 months, he's been okay, but for the money he's gotten in FaZe, definitely not worthy of that salary in terms of all the best players in the world. If you played them all as good as they are, that relevant amount of money, this guy is like a higher level version of Adren. Like, he's been stealing checks for years, and some of the biggest checks in the game in that respect. Like, not necessarily as good as the check that he gets. In fact, certainly not. So I don't feel sorry for him in that sense. He's gotten massively overpaid for the last few years while doing his job. Sure, not his fault, but could have been much better players getting that money. Now, the key thing for me is either he goes back to Portugal and plays in Portugal, which probably means roughly the end of his career. Like, obviously he can play there, and there's like some okay teams, but is there much sponsorship? Doesn't really seem like it. He's never going to be anywhere near the FaZe type money. I have to say, this also shows the hypocrisy of Fox fans, because if Fox was as good as they imagine he is, then he would be instantly snapped up by like Immortals or someone like that. And he'd be brought onto their team, or be brought onto like the Luminosity team. Because remember, those are Brazilian guys. They speak Portuguese. The one problem Fox had in his 1.6 career was there wasn't any teams who were going to be able to pick him up, who had the money, who were actually able to speak Portuguese, like his main language. Well, now all the Brazilians, their scene's risen. They've got 2 teams in the top 10, top 5, top 6, whatever you want to call it as. They've got other teams that people think are on the rise. They all speak Portuguese, slightly different dialect, obviously, but they all speak Portuguese just like he does. Why aren't they going to rush and pick him up? Well, first and foremost, language isn't the issue here. First of all, he's not that great a player. He's 30 years old. And obviously, despite the language similarity, would they pick up a player who's from Portugal if they're Brazilian? I don't know about that, actually. That's an interesting question to ask. I don't know if there's some sort of cultural bias there that they wouldn't want to. I don't know how that works. Now, I do think that actually for a team like Luminosity, or for the 4th best Brazilian team or 5th best Brazilian team, if they have some sort of funding and if they can bring him over, if they have the money, I don't think actually Fox would be a bad pickup for them. I wouldn't pick him on one of the better Brazilian teams, but when you consider he's a very experienced player, he's a player who knows how to play to a decent level on a top international scene, at least, going to the big tournaments, and he's a player who isn't necessarily someone who's, I mean, he's been in the scene at all, hasn't he? So he's not someone who's going to get surprised by what's happening. He probably could pass on some veteran smarts to younger guys, teach them a bit about how the game is when you get to the pro level. These are all valuable qualities to have. You could play in that scenario. The problem I have with Fox is I've never thought he was actually shit. He's only shit in comparison to the best players in the world. Now, I never put him in the best player in the world conversation, but his fans did. His fans always put him in that. They didn't just think he was a good player. They thought he's the best AWPer, or he's one of the best AWPers. Or they'd say, when Kenny S is playing badly, oh, he's better than Kenny S. Oh, he's better than Allu now, they're saying. This is the problem that Fox has had, is that his fans have put him up to a status where then when you knock them off that, it looks like you're attacking him, but you're not really. You're attacking his fans and their stupid perceptions. You're abusing their illusions about how good this guy is. So he was never absolute shit. He was someone where, in terms of internationally, he was a decent to slightly below average player overall. Not least because the biggest problem, like I say, is he was a primary AWPer. So as a primary AWPer, and we're talking about an international level, he was a below average primary AWPer, especially considering we're talking about a team that you'd hope would be in the top 10 teams in the world. If you put him in the top 10 teams in the world, you won't find a primary AWPer who is worse than Fox in that area there. I mean, I guess in some very weird sense, if you really twist the logic, you could say at some point in time that like MSL was the primary opera of Dignitas in the last lineup before KGB. So I guess in that sense, yes, MSL is a worse primary opera than him, but we don't really think of him as a primary opera. He was just using that role, and even then he didn't use the op every round. It wasn't a true primary opera where they gave him the op every round like he was Kenny S. So even then, I don't think it's fair to actually compare in that manner. All the real primary operas were much better than Fox. Now, in terms of Ents, who are the team who are really left out here, I think they're in trouble now because they already weren't that good a team. They were trying to gradually make progress. They were trying to look and develop young talent. Now they've lost their best talent. They've lost the one, at least one time in the world-class player they had, the one really big name as well. I mean, Nasu was a big name 1.6, hasn't been in CSGO. So I think they've got some potential in Nasu. He can still get better. Maybe there's still some young Finnish players can develop, but this is a big setback to lose this guy. Then again, look at it from the positive side. If there are young talents and Allu's gone, if one of them can be a star player one day, guess what? Now is your chance to get thrust into the spotlight. Now is the chance for someone like a Sonny to show us if he's really, really good. Remember when you had AZ and leave Dignitas and Pimp was kicked in 2015. What happened was, I did an interview with Kirby at E-League about this, and this didn't get into the interview because it was just one of those questions that went on the cutting room floor. I don't decide that thing, by the way. And I asked him about the fact that, like, it can't be a coincidence, right? That after those players were kicked, it was a few months later when you yourself started to become a star player legitimately on the international level. And he agreed, like, yeah, once these guys were gone, I sort of understood, like, I had to be a star player. Like, I knew there was room and opportunity for me now, and I had to do it. So I put myself in that position, and I developed into one. So maybe he wouldn't have developed in that way if he's third in line and he's behind these other big names or star player like AZ. So maybe that can work for Ents. At the moment, though, it doesn't look very good for them. I don't think they'll be very relevant either. And so I think overall, good move for everyone except Ents, basically. They're the ones who lose out. I think for Fox, obviously, in theory, it's not a good move for him, but he doesn't have any say in the matter. And I think he's definitely gotten more than enough money over the years from the fucking FaZe sticker money and from all his time in FaZe, G2, Kingwin. I think he's done very well in terms of salary. And he's been an okay player at times, but his fans are just utter cretins, sadly.